Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming today and taking a tour with me through the developing world. So appreciative of your attendance. I'd like to suggest that during the presentation, that if you have some questions, please raise your hand. I don't want to wait till the end of the presentation to take questions because that sometimes doesn't work. So while I'm presenting, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand. And
turn our phones off.
And turn your phone off. So I'd like to spend some time this morning talking about my career, which occurred over the course of 45 years. And it's primarily through conflict and post-conflict situations in the developing world. I'm going to begin. Our journey will take us from roughly the beginning of my career in 1972 through the end of my career in 2018. We'll visit roughly 8 to 10 different countries that all have emerged from very, very difficult situations. These countries are spread out from Eastern Europe, primarily to the Middle East. And only one country we're going to visit is in Asia, and that's my time in Afghanistan. My career begins as a junior in college. I didn't go abroad like many people, but I applied for a program in New York City that was funded by Mayor Lindsay, if you all remember Mayor Lindsay in New York. Mayor Lindsay every year chose 5 students from across the country to be interns in his office, to physically sit in his office and watch the way he managed a city the size of New York. And for some reason, I found that pretty intriguing. So I applied. And I got the job as an intern with Mayor Lindsay. And this is 1967. And I went there. My parents bought me a brand new Brooks Brothers suit because I was a student, didn't have a suit. And I went to work in New York City from a small college in Ohio where I was an undergraduate. And Mayor Lindsay would make assignments to the 5 of us. And we would sit in his office. I was about as far away as I was from Justin to the mayor. And he'd say, this is your assignment for the week. And so what he was trying to do was to show us how cities worked and the complexity of trying to undertake any sort of reform in a city. So he assigned me to a number of things. I got to work in Rikers Island. I got to work with the warden at Rikers Island, which I thought was pretty cool. And so I spent 2 weeks in and out of the warden's office and dealing with the situation there. I also went to the housing authority, which was pretty complicated, and that spurred part of my future as well. But the thing that got me the most was he assigned me to night court, where I looked and watched all the prostitutes and the hookers and the johns come into night court. So I'd leave there at 10 o'clock at night and stay till 5 o'clock in the morning because courts run 24 hours a day in New York City. And I called my parents and I told them what was going on, and my mother said, I sent you to this nice private school and you're studying hookers? It's a true story. And she was upset that they had sent me to Rikers Island as well. But I learned a tremendous amount from working side by side with then what was considered America's foremost mayor. This is also 1967, and remember, this was the Great Society. This was a time when urban development, urban renewal, and cities were being transformed. And I started to really get interested in this idea of urbanism, urban development, and urban renewal. So that was the beginning of my career. So I decided to go to grad school in what would define as urban economics. And I took a program at the University of Maryland, and it was connected to Johns Hopkins. And it was a broad program taking a look at how cities are managed. I was anticipating a career as a college professor, or perhaps at a small college, or director of a large urban program, such as I had been part of in my undergraduate program in New York City. I was really fixated on how cities work, how they are developed, how they are managed. And it became a real passion of mine. And again, remember, this is the Great Society. So there I was at the University of Maryland, and I'd finished my master's in what was defined as urban economics, and I was working on my PhD, and I was bored to death. Bored silly. I was working on a dissertation topic that I didn't particularly like. It was pretty awful. It was about the socioeconomic impact of siting nuclear power plants in small communities. And I'd gotten a fellowship from NASA to work on some issues. And so I was working on it, and I was going out of my mind with boredom. At that very time, something very bizarre happened. All of a sudden, they started recruiting out of the University of Maryland program. And I took an interview with a think tank in Washington called the Ares Corporation. And they were working on urban public policy issues and the issues of public housing in large cities across the country. And they'd gotten this great contract from HUD. So there I was torn. I was ABD, finish my dissertation, or go to work, make a few bucks, and buy a car. Big deal. So I was torn. But guess what? I took the job. I took the job as a research assistant at this think tank called the Ares Corporation. And I was assigned to work on public policy, urban housing in Wilmington, Delaware. Now here I am, 23 years old. I know nothing about the real world except for my time in New York. I was to go, and so my new boss was a pretty cool guy, and he said to me, Bruce, you're going to be working in Wilmington for a couple of years. You need to go meet this new senator who just took the job, got the job, and his name is Joe Biden. And so I oftentimes for the next 3 years spent lots of time with Joe Biden as a new senator. There he is. That's his young picture with his young family in the background. One of those children was killed in the accident. So I worked with Biden, and we would oftentimes go to Wilmington together because he was very passionate about this idea of urban renewal and helping in public housing. I see him today as the same passionate individual. He was pretty terrific at the time, but he was a young senator and he didn't have a lot of clout. And he kept saying, I don't have enough clout to work on this, but we'll get something done. But I didn't realize at the time that the Ares Corporation was in negotiations with the Brookings Institute. So all of a sudden, I became a staffer at the Brookings, which was, so Ares, my company, merged into the Brookings. And the next month changed my life forever. And there's why. So I've been there maybe 6 months at the Brookings. I'm at the water cooler. And what we call the bubble in New England. And these 3 guys are standing behind me. They say, God damn it, we won this contract. We can't get anybody to go and work on this project. Just impossible. And I stood up and I leaned up from the water cooler and I said, I'll go. And the guy said to me, aren't you the new kid in the mailroom? I said, no, I'm a new research assistant. I came here with Ares. He said, come on into my office.
Did you know what the project was?
I had no idea. I just know I wanted to do something. I was clueless. Who knew? I didn't realize that the Brookings had won a new contract with the World Bank. and the Brookings was looking for a young research assistant to help some of their most significantly important urban scholars and international scholars to work on a project. And I was accepted. I volunteered to go, and I said, wherever. Who knew what I was getting myself into? I ended up in Lebanon. I took the job on Thursday, and on Monday, I was on a plane to Beirut. Beirut, Lebanon,
What year was this?
1975. Beirut. I found myself at the Beirut airport. You know, I've been to Europe and the backpacking stuff that we all did as undergraduates, but I'd never been in a war zone. This was the Civil War. I planned on staying 3 weeks. I stayed 3 years. I had brought just enough clothes for 3 weeks, and then I stayed and I fell in love with the whole concept. But I was working as a research assistant for about 12 or 15 very distinguished, people that I just admired completely, and we all were living in this war zone. So I was there from 1977, not 75, 77 to roughly 1980. If any of you have been to Beirut, it was considered the Paris of the Middle East. That's the Georges V Hotel, going up in flames and being destroyed by the Syrian invasion. These are some photos that I have from the war. This is what it looked like where I lived.
Can you remind us who was fighting whom at that point?
I'm going to get to that, but I will remind you now. There are so many factions, it's hard to tell. There are Christians versus Muslims. There are 10 or 12 Christian rebellious groups and probably 15 or 20 Muslim groups all fighting each other. One had to have a scorecard to figure out who was whom. Overlay that with the fact that Syria was constantly bombing the city because Syria wanted to take over Lebanon. Yes, sir.
You haven't told us your assignment yet.
I'm going to. I just arrived. So this is a little backup. The Civil War really began in 75. The city of Beirut, considered again this Paris of the Middle East, was basically destroyed. There was a green line. There was a stretch of greenery between the East Beirut, which was Christian, West Beirut, which was Muslim, and God forbid one should cross the other. The World Bank's contract was to assess the financial and physical damage of the civil war in Beirut so that they could help rebuild the country from the core up, from the bottom up. And if any of you know Peter and Hannah Wakey, who live here they were there at the same time, and we used to hang out at the same bar, by the way. It's an interesting story, but their overlap with me was incredible. They were there for a very different reason, but I was there to work with the Brookings. And basically the idea was what was it going to take to put the country back together? And it's something like Brookings that they would give that contract to. Basically, my job was to look at the physical infrastructure, look at the water systems, the sanitation systems, the roads, the bridges, the schools, the hospitals. And I traveled up and down the country for 3 years. This is a photo of what it was like living in Beirut at the time. There were tanks everywhere, and you had to carry your diplomatic passport or your papers, or they stopped you at every turn. This is a picture taken from my time of several, and I don't even know who these were. One never knew which faction was fighting which. There were roughly 30 or 40 fighting each other at any one time. This is a photo of a family begging to probably cross the green line to see relatives. which hardly ever happened. They hardly ever let that happen, and the factions would stop people from moving from one place to the other. Life in Beirut. I lived in the Palestinian section in West Beirut, and in the building, I lived in the same floor as Yasser Arafat's brother. Dr. Fatih Arafat, he headed the Red Crescent. He was a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Medical School. And he again headed up the Red Crescent. And my wife at the time became friendly with his wife. And they let my wife enter the Palestinian camps, the refugee camps. And so she got to know them very well. And we became fast friends. It's an interesting story. And she would work with Dr. Arafat's wife in the camps. So our life was really quite interesting, and things were quiet for many, many months. But he was a terrifically interesting guy, but of course very controversial. I was stunned by the devastation. I mean, I was a suburban kid from New England that hadn't been anywhere really. And here I was working in a war zone, and I was struck by the resilience of humanity and how after years and years of bombing, they could still go on. But the anger over religion drove much of the rage, of people's rage. It was constant. I hate this person, I hate that person because they're X or Y. In 1978, the Syrian siege of Akrafia, the main Christian district of Beirut, really became one of the most important catalytic movements and moments in the history of Beirut. It became unimaginable for us to live there. The Syrian invasion lasted for months. My wife and I were tossed out of our 15th floor building by a bomb. That Syria had dropped about 100 yards away from our building, and we lost everything. We spent 10 days in a bomb shelter with 800 other people in one bathroom. We were evacuated in 1969. The Palestinian owner of the building we lived in put us on the floor of a school bus and put papers over us and took us out of Beirut because they never bombed or they never harmed school buses. So we went out of Beirut in a school bus north to Juni, where we caught a fishing boat to Cyprus, at which time my wife had a nervous breakdown and we spent 3 months in Cyprus and then on to Greece. But we were living for 2 weeks in a shelter with lots of other people, and it was pretty horrific. I swear I'd never do this kind of work again. There's another picture of, that's the building next to the building that we lived in. So after a while, after roughly 3 years, you become rather immune. All car bombs scenes start to look alike, and you start to become immune to it. You stop noticing the stunned pedestrians who happen to be standing next to the bombing. You get used to shattered glass everywhere. My wife used to say to me, when we leave here, we should start a glass company in Beirut because we could be billionaires in about a week. You still focus on the smells and sound of a wonderful city. Life went on. Roasted lamb, olive oil being pressed. Life went on through this unimaginable chaos. Here's what I say. Beirut is insane and yet incredulous. Against the backdrop of the most carefree of daily activities, people doing ordinary things in the middle of this chaos. They were lying on the beach, the Corniche, on the Mediterranean, was packed every day with people sunning themselves, eating in cafes, and bombs would just go off all the time. The city lived between security and insecurity, war and truce. This is my favorite quote. We got the English language paper every week, and this was in it, and I saved it. I want to read it. We offer you shattered resistant windows coverings to protect yourself and the people around you from the everyday occurrence of flying glass. Remember, anytime, any place, an explosion can happen and you can be hurt or killed. Protect yourself and your loved ones. That to me symbolizes what Beirut was.
I guess that wasn't an advertisement to come to Beirut.
So, after 3 years in our very difficult time getting out of the country, and a really tough time 3 to 6 months after it because of all the chaos, I still decided that this is what I wanted to do, and it really begins my career in working for the rest of my life in conflict and post-conflict situations for the next 40 years. But basically, in my role, I learned a lot in Beirut. I learned I learned a lot from Mayor Lindsay, but I learned a tremendous amount in Beirut about the idea of how to provide physical infrastructure, how to plan for it, develop it, and financing it. And I worked primarily for large organizations such as the UN, USAID, foundations and philanthropic institutions. The objective of technical assistance is to provide expertise needed to promote development in post-conflict situations primarily. Most technical assistance programs in this country began during the Marshall Plan of 1949, but it really began with Truman. Truman was the beginning of what we define as foreign assistance today. The countries of Africa and Central America and South America were attempting to improve their standard of living, and Harry Truman knew that. And in his second inaugural, Harry Truman laid out what we now define as current technical assistance or foreign assistance. His four-point program in 1949 was a notable example of what we call foreign assistance today. And it really set the stage for what we did for the next many years. As the U.S., we should share scientific and technical knowledge to less fortunate countries. By helping the less fortunate to a decent life, all of humanity benefits. Democracy alone can fight against enemies such as hunger, misery, and despair. And one of the roles of the U.S., he believed, was to strive toward personal freedom for all mankind. Those were the 4 points of his second inaugural. Just 70 years later, we're still doing much of the work that Harry Truman laid out. And in fields such as irrigation, infrastructure, governance, public policy, law, public health, by the way, which is most important today, and forestry. Those are the areas. Today, we're doing very much of the same thing. To maintain a functional global society, again, which began under the Marshall Plan. Today's world, Biden's world, 55% of the foreign aid is economic, administered by the United States Agency for International Development and state, and roughly 1/3 is military aid. We are the largest single provider of foreign aid worldwide in US dollars, but most developed countries, and these Canada, Japan, France, and Sweden, spend a higher percentage of their GDP on foreign aid. A small portion just goes to governments, but much goes to NGOs, non-governmental associations, and multilateral organizations. Today, as of right now, these are the 5 largest aid recipients in the world. You might be surprised to see Ethiopia as perhaps the most we give the most aid to in Biden's administration, and that's because there has been a 5-year drought in the country. Malnourishment is a huge issue. They are in need of water, which they are supplying. They're in need of food. And what's interesting, there's also a public health issue. Mothers are selling their daughters to men for food.
Oh,
And this was just reported in the State Department. And so the aid to Ethiopia will become even more important. But this is the largest recipient of US aid today, and it's most striking because most people would never consider it.
Bruce, I'm surprised to see Syria on that list.
Yes. Refugee issues. Refugees, which I'm going to be talking about, by the way, Monica.
Okay.
So, yes, I worked with the Syrian refugee camps for almost 6 months. So, yes, sir.
How is this compared to the aid you give to Israel?
The aid you give to Israel is somewhere, we give a lot of military aid, but the aid to Israel, I believe, is around $850 million a year in humanitarian aid. Ukraine, as of to date, the end of last year, this is a 2022 figure, was $2.1 billion in humanitarian aid. So that's just a snapshot. In a 2021 poll of US citizens, about 28% of our total US budget, most people believe that roughly about 28 or 30% of our entire budget goes to foreign aid, when in fact it's about 1.2%. And in 2020, half Americans believe that foreign aid should be dramatically reduced, but as many as 82% support foreign aid when asked about a specific program. So, I worked in 26 countries over the course of 44 years. Some countries that I think I did some good in, it was just the beginning of the rest of the discussion. Slovakia, Poland, Jordan, Liberia, and Albania are countries, and Egypt. Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, and Uganda, not so much. I think there were failures on the part of the US government and failures on my part. So we're going to be exploring both where I see the good, the bad, and the ugly, where I think I did some credible work and where I not some work that wasn't so good, and the reasons for that. And again, just some clients that we worked with, I worked with the European Central Bank, DFID, which is the British aided organization, many NGOs, the World Bank, UN, others. And I say this, the work was pretty tedious and boring at times. Frustrating because you're working in a different culture, tended to be very overly bureaucratic, but at the same time was very exhilarating because you're in an entirely different culture. It was challenging, and I ended up loving the work. And I would not have traded it for $1,000, whatever. I just loved it. Let's look at some countries where I worked. This is a country not many Americans think much about, but I had a great time there, and I did what I think is credible work. This is Albania, in the West Balkans, southwestern part of Europe, perhaps one of the poorest countries in the world. The communist regime fell in 1991, much like the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. There was a civil war in 1997. But eventually the government was toppled by a pyramid scheme, which in the formal market was not working, and the informal market took over, and the country was once again destroyed in 1997. The pyramid scheme took down what had started to be a capitalist economy. It is a country that has been isolated from the world for over 60 years. In development terms, we call that a starving state. Country is divided 56% Muslim and 10% Christian. And it's perpetual conflict and has been for hundreds of years. And it's Albania, and it's not Armenia. How many times have I said, people said, oh, you worked in Armenia. No, I didn't work in Armenia, I worked in Albania. It's actually the poorest country in.
I had a question. Could you sort of describe what a pyramid scheme is for a government? I don't quite understand that.
I'm not totally sure what a pyramid scheme was, except it was money flowed to the top.
And never got to.
And never got to the middle or lower classes.
But you said it was the start of capitalism?
No, there was a start of capitalism in 1991. So for 6 years, it sort of started to configure as a capitalist society. The thing that brought it down was that the same people who were in charge during the communist era of 45 years then started to run the banks and started to run the financial institutions and gather the development money from outside the country and held it and didn't distribute it to the middle or lower classes. And that's what happened. And I'm going to explain that a little more. I hope that's
Putin's Russia.
what?
Like Putin's Russia.
Like Putin's Russia. So Enver Hoxha ran the country for 40 years. He was a true and tried sociopath. He was an insane syphilitic. He left the country in ruins after World War II and continued this repressive regime with forced labor camps, random street killings, muggings, rapes, etc. And here we are right in Southern Europe. Hoxha. So this is when I arrived. When I arrived in 1980, the country in 1989, had no more than 1,000 cars, and only 30% of the homes had electricity, and 20% had safe drinking water. This is 1989 in Europe. And Hoxha was a great believer in communist revolutionary Mao Zedong. He was a great believer in Chinese philosophy, and he was great friends with the Chinese, and he traded, and the Albanians, he trained corps of men to become thugs, and he would send them to China. And the regime in China, for every man that he sent, would send a car back to Albania. So, because they had no ability to build cars. And so his strongest relationship was with communist China and his belief in his beloved Mao Zedong. The country was completely destroyed, and he was a complete madman for 45 years. So when he was overthrown in 1989 and hung in the streets, the country had no infrastructure whatsoever to speak of. Again, strong ties to the Chinese. So I was sent to Albania in 2002. Part of an effort to understand what the hell was going on in the country. And my job was to look at the environmental infrastructure. And I was we were hired, I was at the Urban Institute at the time in Washington. And we were hired by the World Bank and the European Union to look at what the hell was going on in the country. So our initial effort was to look at solid waste management. Pretty boring, trash. Waste was uncontrolled. It was everywhere. There had never been any waste cleanup in the country. Side roads, beaches, historic Roman ruins, rivers, the Mediterranean, wherever you looked, there were piles and piles and piles of trash. And it became a public health issue. Albania's public health, in comparison to the rest of Europe, was at the lowest level ever. And illness was prevalent because they just had trash everywhere. And I just can't even describe to you. I'm going to show you some pictures of what it looked like. But my job was to figure out what the hell to do with all this trash. I mean, I was a high-paid trash man. So we put out an RFP, a request for proposal, to many European countries, and we retained a Spanish firm to come in and to train mayors and NGOs to work to pick up trash in this country. By the way, one of the reasons that trash was such an important issue, they were throwing it into the Mediterranean, into the rivers, and it was floating north to Croatia. And Dubrovnik's harbor was filled with trash from Albania, and Croatia sued Albania for non-compliance of European standards. And so that's one of the reasons I should have mentioned that we were brought in to look at the waste program. So my job was to figure out how to pick up the trash. So we put an RFP together to 13 different companies around the world, and Spaniards came in and decided to send 400 trucks to Albania to start to pick up the trash, and it would take up to 10 years. And within a year, they were gone. They said it was impossible to do because there was no infrastructure. People didn't care about the trash, so they left. So I don't know, it's a failed situation. Here's a picture of the beach on the Adriatic. We took
Now, where did the trash, where was it disposed? Like that?
everywhere.
No, but did they cover it up with the
No.
Spanish people?
But they tried, they started, but they got nowhere. And they didn't have anybody that was interested in it, so they left. But the picture that I wish I had for you was the picture of, there's these beautiful, in the city of Durrës, on the coast, in the Adriatic coast, these beautiful Roman ruins. They're stunning. I mean, they rival anything in the rest of Europe, and they're still there. And they were filled 50 feet high with trash. And so
Have you been back? Is it still like that?
I haven't been back, but I hear it's as bad, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. It's a failed state, what we call a failed state. But these are just some pictures. So Albania is 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The same group of people who ran the country during the communist era are still in charge. The average age, I was just reading before I came here today, the Foreign Assistance and Foreign Affairs magazine, the same group of people are still in charge, and their rough age is about 85 to 87, and they're still running the country.
Kind of.
Yeah. The construction industry is completely illegal. Bribery is the norm. They are trying. There's a group that's trying to make Albania a tourist destination. And why I'm so interested in Albania too is I grew up in Boston, and the largest diaspora of Albanians in the country is Boston. And Barrett and I had a friend named Phil Giantris who raised millions of dollars to help and support the reforms in Albania. And I became very attached to him and his mission. And he actually had one of his daughters move out, and she became the Minister of Environment for about 6 weeks before she left. She couldn't handle the corruption. They're still trying to implement structural reforms in this poor country. Again, the poorest in Europe. In 2014, they made an application to join the EU. That application has been denied every year since, and the denial is because of the public health issue, solid waste issue. They have refused to pick it up, and they live with this day after day. So that wasn't a particularly good assignment on my part.
So no young people ever,
The diaspora continues, has the largest diaspora in Europe. They've lost over 18% of their population. They flee to either Europe or the United States, and again to Boston, where there's a huge Albanian population. They can't keep young people. It's a failed economy.
Yeah.
So Egypt. It's another one of my favorite places to have worked. Again, I'm a very high-priced trash man. Solid waste, for some reason, got into my resume. And we were asked, again, I was at the Urban Institute, and we were asked to look at the whole trash situation in 3 governorates or 3 territories: Cairo, Alexandria, and Calabria, which is adjacent to Cairo. We were contracted by the World Bank and the European Union to identify and solve the waste management problem in Egypt. There is a culture in Egypt. If anybody's been to Egypt, I don't know if you noticed it, but there's a culture called the Zabalin, a word which in Arabic means garbage people. 60 to 85,000 people are estimated to live in and around the dump sites in Egypt.
Right.
It's a world of shocking odors and very off-putting. It makes one gag, actually. They are the Coptic Christians. They are the 10% of the population that is Coptic. They live with pigs in the high-rises they create out of trash. And it's one of the few areas in Cairo where you can get a pork dinner.
What makes a Coptic Christian, is it different from a Christian?
It's an Orthodox,
Jewish or Russian
It's-
Orthodox?
it's close to, it's an Middle East Orthodox religion. It's very, it reminds me when I went to a Coptic church of a Greek Orthodox church.
Okay.
And they're about 10% of the population of the country is Coptic. They are poor, and this is their livelihood.
They sift through the trash to find stuff.
There they are.
so it looks like they're trash haulers.
Yes. And this is the buildings in which they live, and they create, and they have built out of trash. Zabalin. They collect garbage. Now remember, Cairo is a city of 19 million people, growing at 1.3 million people per year. The Zabs, as they're known, collect the garbage for free, bring it back to their homes, and recycle it. They are perhaps, and this is my understanding, they're perhaps some of the most efficient recyclers in the world. They recycle about 85% of the trash thrown out the streets. They are incredibly entrepreneurial. They do all the sorting by hand. The government has never given them any machines because they're so incredibly poor, and they're considered sort of part of the, in a caste system, they'd be the lowest of the low. They then resell the materials, often internationally. Problem is, that international buyers demand consistency, and they can't provide that. They want uniformity, consistency. And the Zabs don't have the skill sets or the machinery to make it as such. You cannot believe how they live. And I spent about 5 days living on the fringe of this community to understand who they were and what they were doing. 5 days was not enough, but it's all I was given. They've been collecting since 1940. Basically, roughly, as the estimate is, that 85,000 people do this on a daily basis. With more than 18 people in the city, they produce about 14,000 tons of trash every day. They gather about 2/3 of Cairo's waste and, again, recycle about 85%. So my job was to work with the Ministry of the Environment. And the minister was a woman, which is unusual in Egypt, Laila Iskender. She herself is a Coptic Christian. She went to UC Berkeley, got her master's and PhD in environmental studies, and came back and decided to spend the rest of her life helping her community. And I became fast friends with her. And Barrett may recall when I came back from Egypt one time, didn't I bring some Christmas presents that the Coptics had made me, Barrett? Out of many of the raw materials they produce. But I have to tell you, so it was incredible. I mean, I just don't even have the words to describe. So here I am doing this work for the World Bank. They asked me what it was going to take to solve the problem because Cairo was filthy and it was causing all kinds of public health issues. So the administration wanted to mechanize the collection system. And for me, it was a huge conflict because I was taking away the life, the ability of the Zabaleen, if we in fact mechanize the solid trash movement in Cairo, Alexandria, and Kalyabaya, we would take away the livelihood of roughly 85,000 people. And so, on one hand, I was asked by the World Bank to figure out how to mechanize this system. I was conflicted by my caring for the subs.
Question. Why is the World Bank cleaning up Egypt? Why aren't Egypt cleaning up Egypt?
Because they don't have the money.
So they go to the World Bank?
They go to the World Bank.
Okay, so I'd say
This-
we need some help.
Whether we think of it or not, this is still a developing country.
Yeah.
On a scale of different countries, and many people seek financing from the World Bank or from the IMF, which is this kind of sister organization, particularly for public infrastructure. That's why I did so much work with the bank. This also was a contract not only with the bank, but they were also subcontractors, the European Union and the USAID. So they were all supporting this idea of mechanizing solid waste because it was a public health issue.
So the World Bank comes up with some suggestions and
Yes,
says we will lend you some money.
we will lend you X, and my job was to take X and figure out what to do.
Okay, so somewhere along this line, you're going to the the Egyptian government and saying, this is the plan.
This is the plan. But they had asked the bank in the first place to bring someone in to help them figure out what to do.
So when you gave them the plan, how aggressively did they implement it?
Not very.
Okay.
So again, we put out a request for proposal, and again, the Spaniards, who are the world's trash collectors, won the contract to collect and recycle the waste. And I must say that the Spaniards are still there. They have taken charge of the waste management issues in the country, but they have also allowed the Zabalin to continue in many ways with their culture and their way of life. It's been a kind of a win-win for everybody, if I understand it.
I'm feeling very naive. I was in India for a while, living in a nice neighborhood, and people would throw the trash out of the street, and a very similar caste would come along and take what they could recycle and just burn little piles of what was left over. I always thought it was amazingly efficient.
It is
Yes, I had
It
no
is
idea that somewhere there was a trash mess. Wow.
They're everywhere.
So I'm curious, with the World Bank involvement in that, who actually let the contract and managed the contract with the Spaniards?
The government,
The government did,
the Ministry of Environment, Lila.
which is why it continued. After
She
you left.
had education, she understood the public policy, she understood the issue. She became a great friend of mine, and she was smart as a cat, and she understood the culture of the Coptics, or the Zabs, and so therefore it worked. If we could, I'd like to turn to one of my favorite countries, Liberia, West Africa. America's American heritage. Founded in 1847 by freed men and former slaves. It was and continues to be a failed state in my jargon. Now has a constitutional government, but I don't believe it. I'm sorry, the wording is wrong, but a coup occurred in 1989, and then it led to 10 years of dictatorship. I mean, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. But in 1989, President Samuel Doe was overthrown by a gentleman by the name of Charles Taylor, who was from Plymouth, Massachusetts. He was an African American, his parents were Liberian, and he was a thug. And he was in jail in Plymouth for many, many crimes. And he escaped and returned to Liberia, to his home country, and overthrew a sitting president, which led to violence, brutal fighting, and a total collapse of the state. 1/10 of the population was killed, and 1/3 of the population became refugees. Then, in 2003, two sets of drug-induced teenage rebels overthrew Charles Taylor. So we got two revolutions in about 10 years. And the country was basically in a revolutionary state for 14 years. But if you may recall reading the newspapers, these were the child soldiers of Liberia. The average age was 9, carrying automatic weapons and shooting each other and basically overthrowing Charles Taylor, who fled to Nigeria and then to Sierra Leone and was captured by Interpol and brought to The Hague and has been in jail in England since, I think, 2003. So they captured the first rebel that took over the government, Charles Taylor, who was a native of Plymouth, Mass. And then he was overthrown by these two marauding rebel groups of young teenagers who just overthrew the entire country. Country plunged into chaos, 88% of the population was somehow affected. We now, and it was in what we call in my business extreme consumption poverty. The country was completely destroyed in 2003. In come 15,000 UN peacekeepers to try to keep things going. They start to rule the country in 2004 into 2005. It's a picture of some of the teenage rebels. Over 800,000 people were either harmed or killed amongst these rebellious movements. In comes Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, 2005. A Liberian citizen, educated at University of Colorado Boulder on a master's degree in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School. And she decides to run for president. 2006 to 2018, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson becomes president of Liberia, the first woman president of an African country. She is the most educated person at that time in Liberia. Ellen finished at Harvard and again went to work for the World Bank. Here we go with the World Bank again. And she decided to write a book on her life story. Her father had been a judge in Liberia. And she joined the Urban Institute, where I was the co-director of the international division. And so she worked for me. And when she became president, she asked the Urban Institute to come over and help build a country. That was her terms. Let's build a country. So I went over as an advisor to the president, and we were building something from the ground up. So we became her kitchen cabinet, because there was no one in the country that had the skill sets to help her. So she relied on her friends, her buddies, to help out. So we worked on everything from transportation, water, just about everything you could imagine. This is a country the size, it's the exact same size of the state of Tennessee. And when I arrived, it had 10 miles of paved roads and no stoplights and one hotel run by the Lebanese. So I was really comfortable with Lebanese. It was hard to imagine that it was in fact a country. The poverty rate was the worst in Africa and ranked 232nd in the world in terms of poverty. One of the assignments she gave me, which was, I was really ticked, I didn't know how the hell to do it. She said, I want you to figure out if there's enough talent in this country to start a private sector economy. Do we have anybody in this country, Bruce, that can, we need to jumpstart some sort of private enterprise. That is the necessary reform to make this a real live country. And my answer to her was, no, there's nobody. And I spent weeks roaming around the country looking for some private talent. But there was nobody that had, virtually there was no educational level whatsoever. There was not a university in the country, and those who had left stayed out and didn't want to come back. So she was it. She was the educated person in the country. Her main priorities were three: stem the corruption, reduce the debt, 4.7 billion, which the US and the IMF, along with Germany, helped to reduce, and try to bring peace to the country. I have to understand, like the other countries we've talked about, there were numerous factions all fighting with each other. This was a rural, remote country. There were, I believe at the time, 35 different sects, which were all fighting with each other. And she was trying to get control of chaos. So the World Bank has something called the heavily indebted poor countries. And Liberia was considered the worst of the poorest countries of the time. So she comes from Washington, D.C., her life in Georgetown, and picks up and moves basically into a hut and becomes the president of a country. Not an easy feat.
Where did you live?
I lived in
Tent?
the Lebanese hotel. The Lebanese, by the way, will go anywhere and build a hotel anywhere. I found this through my life's work. And we lived in a hotel, if you can call it that, had no air conditioning. It was a room. It was like a rooming house. And that was it in Monrovia, which is the capital. It was dreadfully hot, dreadfully poor, and I wondered what the hell I was doing there.
Was Ellen elected? How?
She was elected by then what was considered a supposed democratic process. And her rival was Liberia's most famous soccer player, who had a third-grade education, but he played for Madrid and he played for, I forget which team in England. And he is now the president of the country. He beat her in 2018.
It's not George Weah.
It's George Weah.
Okay.
He claims to have a degree from the University of Phoenix. And he had that on his CV. But he clearly, if you've ever listened to him speak, and he clearly, he speaks English, but I don't think he has much of an education, though he did beat her.
I'm curious, I think back to some of the countries, that long before this, they would always be thought leaders, people who everyone looked up to. Didn't you find anyone like that?
No. Well, yeah, it's true. Yeah, we found some people. We found some judges. Ellen's father was a judge in the court system, so he helped us find some folks. But the level of corruption was so high.
Yeah.
I mean, the bakshish. Just to get a meal at the hotel, I would give them $5, and then they'd stand there with their hand out just to get fed. And you're at a hotel with a lot of diplomats and whoever was there at the time. I mean, the corruption was monumental. And it continues to be a failed state under George Weah, soccer player. Ellen was a breath of fresh air in the country. And while she was there, the standard of living did rise dramatically. And I was very happy she asked me to write the strategy, the poverty reduction strategy for the country, which we presented to the World Bank and the European Union. So I was the writer of that policy. And I believe that's where I really helped her, was trying to get more financing for all kinds of things that were needed in the country. So I was the editor or the writer. I was the original writer of the strategy, which we presented to the European Union.
How did the level of prosperity increase? Was it because people had more education, they had more? First of all, she brought in money. She was opening schools. She had 13 years, so she was opening schools. She was sending people to university in Europe and the U.S. I mean, she was using the money for valuable reforms. And she was trying desperately, but she was constantly fighting corruption, constantly fighting physically
warlords who were part of each and every region of the country. The only other country that I believe was as failed as Liberia that I worked in was Zimbabwe, where President Mugabe lived for 43 years and ruled with an iron hand, and they lost most of their white population to South Africa, and it became an incredibly failed state. And we were sent there for the same reason that I was sent to Liberia, was to kind of figure out what the hell to do. Again, these international organizations, the bank, the EU, European Central Bank, DFID, the Canadians, the Japanese, all these countries and organizations trying to figure out what to do with these failed states. And I was a consultant working for these people. And so I roamed from failed state to failed state. But clearly the two in Africa that I had my most difficult time was Liberia and Zimbabwe. Actually, in Zimbabwe, when I arrived, I was followed by the secret police, and I took refuge in the Anglican Cathedral in downtown Harare, and they threatened to do away with me. And they brought me into the police station, and I stayed overnight, and I thought I was going to be killed. And I decided not to stay in Zimbabwe very long, but I did go back on 2 or 3 different occasions. But that was a country filled with thugs and people who were clearly not wanting any sort of reform. So we can continue on to Eastern Europe and begin that. We've got about 20 more minutes. Would you like to continue, or any more questions before I move on? Yes, sir.
Are you going to, this is a horrific story, your life is really much more than interesting. Are you going to be able to give us a hope and solutions?
It's at the end of Thursday. Please come next Tuesday. Please come next Tuesday. Thursday's election. Next Tuesday. I've got the answer next Tuesday. It's the classic answer.
So it depends.
It depends.
Then the World Bank's modus operandus is they're not going to make any money. They accept they're going to lose money, and more prosperous countries just pour into this bucket.
Yes.
Okay. Just trying to understand the rules.
Is that part of the money that we call USAID, that we're putting out, it goes to the World Bank?
Or close to no, USAID directly to the country or to an NGO. We also give money. We are the largest contributor, which is another pot of money, to the World Bank, which is made up of 183 countries that support the World Bank.
So
on H Street.
Is anybody accountable for anything in this?
Yes. No, they are. They are accountable. And they do try to recoup what they can, but they're not in the business of recouping for the most part.
What form does this accountability, or what form has it taken? Is anyone fired? No. I mean,
no, but there's been a lot of great successes too.
Oh.
I'm pointing out
All his failures.
all my failures. I mean, I'm just a consultant to the bank, but basically there's been a tremendous amount of good that the World Bank has done, where they do recoup many of the resources that they provide. I'm showing you places where it hasn't worked very well.
okay.
You got to be assigned to one of them, I hope, now and then to.
Well, I did. I mean, I'm going to show you one of my favorites. My favorite, Barrett will know, my husband will know, Purdy, which is one of the great success stories. So we're going to have a good success story as well as Poland and Jordan are my 2 favorite success stories. And the World Bank has done marvelous work in both and recouped their money with interest in both cases.
Does the World Bank, they probably dissect why things didn't work.
All the time.
And so do they avoid repeating that in other countries?
They certainly tried to.
Yeah.
Yes. But the World Bank is ruled by 183 countries. It's not much of a
geez.
democracy. It's,
That says enough.
so, what do we got? We got some time. So
Let me ask you a question about the teenagers that we saw with all the high-powered arms. Where did they obtain those? Where did they get the money, or did they, I mean, how did they arm themselves
Drugs,
if they're so very young?
drugs.
Drugs and warlords. The largest supplier of arms in the world is Slovakia,
Really?
and the Slovaks will provide arms to anybody. They were also received lots of. They're in West Africa, and they are surrounded by Sierra Leone, which is was also a failed state, and many of them crossed the border and got arms. Sierra Leone wanted to take, it's a longer story, but Sierra Leone wanted to take over the country of Liberia and make it one country, so they were providing arms to these teenage rebels. And again, the average age of the rebels was 9. It's amazing. It was a child, they called it child war. It was a remarkable time. And again, Ellen came in right after that and had a completely uneducated population in a country the size of Tennessee. And then she's trying to figure out what to do first, what to prioritize. Do we try to create an economy? Do we try to create a private sector economy, which she asked me to look at? Do we rebuild the infrastructure? Do we go to the World Bank, the European Union, different Canadians, Japanese, and rebuild the economy? Again, another thing that I didn't mention is Firestone, the American tire company, was the largest client of the state of Liberia. Liberia is filled with rubber plantations, with rubber. And Firestone got most of its rubber in the 70s and 80s, 60s, 70s, and 80s from the country of Liberia, but they stopped during the Civil War. So the rubber plantations to this day sit stagnant because no one wants to work with a failed state.
So to your point about the arms, isn't that one of the issues that kind of rests a little bit on us right now when we leave a country and leave all the military stuff together?
Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yeah. It
So
is.
Slovakia probably comes in and size it up for pennies on a dollar.
So I remember sitting, you'll see in my work in Eastern Europe, one of the first countries I worked in was Slovakia. And I remember sitting in a bar in Bratislava one night, and the guy sitting next to me, and I'm just sitting in the bar because it's in the hotel. And the guy comes up to me and says, "You look like you're an American." I said, "Yeah, I'm an American." And he says, "Want to buy some arms?" And I said, "Excuse me, I work in international development. I try to do good in the world." And he said to me, I said, "So what do you do?" He said, "Well, I'm an arms merchant." He said, "You know, Slovakia is the largest producer. That's what our export is. We export arms all over the world." And I had no idea at the time, but that was 1992. Yeah, that was really creative. I'm going to only spend a little time talking about Eastern Europe. I spent many years working and living in 7 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Again, we all remember the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which prompted so much to happen. The whole fall of the wall. I think many of you know that. Thousands of East Germans streamed into the West. We all remember that, celebrating on both sides of the wall. It was the culminating point of the revolutionary change sweeping Eastern Europe. Throughout the Soviet bloc, reformers ended over 40 years of dictatorial communist rule and centralized authority. This was part of the time we all remember. The country of Poland was, and to this day, an incredibly interesting place. The reform movement and then communism in East and Central Europe began in Poland. Solidarity, Lech Walesa, started a wave of strikes that brought the government to a halt. Poland's Communist Authority, under pressure from Moscow, declared martial law in 1981, arresting Lech Walesa, Solidarity's leadership, and banned the trade unions. But it didn't bring an end to Solidarity.
What did banning the trade unions have to do
The
with it?
trade unions were where the revolutionary fervor was building up, primarily in the northern part of the country, in Gdansk, where Lech Walesa was headquartered. But the movement went underground, and the rebellious Poles organized their civil society, beginning to separate themselves from the government and build their own government. They entered into a series of talks. Solidarity became very popular and formed the first communist government within the Soviet Union since 1948. We all remember these pictures, I believe, of Solidarity. This is in Gdansk and Gdynia, up in the north coast of Poland. The same thing was going on in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, better known as Czechoslovakia. They took to the streets. Leading the demonstration in Prague was Václav Havel, co-founder of the Reform Group. And this became the Velvet Revolution. This became an incredibly powerful force, as we perhaps all remember. There's Prague. This is when Czechoslovakia divided into two countries, Czech Republic and Slovakia. They were never meant to be together in the first place. Same thing happened in Romania and Bulgaria.
I have a question on.
I'm sorry,
Why did they divide?
why did they divide? They were culturally very different. It was culture. Beg your pardon? Oh, that's some. Oh, that's. Yeah, they were culturally very different kinds of. They were religiously and culturally different, and they were brought together after World War I, and they were never meant to be together. And so they split. It gave them a chance to split. The interesting place was Romania. Ceausescu, Nicholas Ceausescu, ruled Romania for 40 years. And he was forced out in December 1989, and he was hung by his neck on Christmas Day, December of 1989, in the town square. He and his wife were scientists, and they performed unbelievably unimaginable, horrific scientific atrocities on their citizens for 45 plus years. Both were syphilitic. He was blind at the end of his life, and she was a paraplegic due to the syphilis. They were horrific people, and when they were hung in 1989, nobody cared. At the same time, next door, the Bulgarian Communist Party just gave up and basically left the country and abandoned the country. So all these countries were falling at the same time. But Ceausescu's story is incredible. He built himself a palace with 350 rooms and used slave labor to build it. And then he would conduct experiments on the folks that he had retained to build his palace. This is a picture we took of when I arrived in Poland of a bakery, and this was what was available at the time. Remember that this was, again, a communist, what I consider a failed state. So The reform in Poland really occurred in the beginning of 1990 and really took off more than any other country in the Eastern Bloc. The government tried to stabilize the economy and create the conditions necessary for privatization and a market economy. The impact was profound, and all of a sudden, Poland, under its new regime, takes off. It was considered shock therapy by the World Bank, by the EU. This couldn't possibly happen. Nothing could happen this fast. This country is incredible. All of a sudden, they go from communism to a new form of government. I won't call it a democratic government, but a new form of government, and they achieved literal economic reform within a few months and years. It became the darling of the US government and USAID and US State Department. I was, again, at the Urban Institute at the time, and we, the Urban Institute, won the contract to go in and to provide consulting experience and guidance in 8 cities over a 3-year period, and to build capacity and help this government that was moving forward with some of their reform efforts in infrastructure, education, investigation, and I was the leader of the pack, and we had roughly 50 people moving over to Poland to be involved in this reform effort. We hired Harvard University, the University of North Carolina, and Stanford economists from all those schools to come over and help us. And I was there in and out of Poland. I made 43 trips to Poland in 3 years. I never lived there because we were based in Boston. Former ambassador to Poland, Nicholas Reyes, if anybody knows St. Michael's, his widow lived in Poland, and while he was ambassador. And when we got together, she said, "I remember several things, Bruce: henna hair in the women, purple suits, no food in the markets, selling possessions on the street, lots of begging, everything dark, and few street lights, and really dismal." And that's what his widow said to me, and that's exactly the way I perceive Poland at the time when we arrived after the fall of communism. Men wore purple suits. You could buy a suit in the store for $1.50, and they hung off of you like a drapery, and they were ugly as hell. And the women all had henna hair. And Mrs. Ray, the first thing she said to me is, "Henna hair, Bruce." And I went, "Yes, remember the henna hair." The Urban Institute, we were in 8 cities, I was leading the non-military building of Eastern Europe, and we were headquartered in Poland. But we worked in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, doing the same kind of work. And again, public sector finance, local government policies, economic development, infrastructure development, hundreds of millions of dollars poured into Eastern Europe from the US government. My role was all to figure out what to do with all this aid money and how to prioritize the reform efforts. Some photos we have of Poland. This is what it looked like. Kind of dreary and dismal. This is a picture we took of the first McDonald's opening in Warsaw. And the line was around the corner. And I'll never forget that because they made a big deal of it. It was the headline in the local newspaper, American newspaper, for weeks. They were going to open a McDonald's. So I think I'll stop. And next time, I'd like to move on to the Middle East, where I spent lots of years in Jordan and West Bank, Gaza, and we'll talk about that. Do I have any questions?
How many languages can you speak?
None. I'm very poor in English. I speak a pretty decent French. I can understand Arabic. I can't speak it, but I hear it.
Well,
And I've sat in so many meetings with Arab cultures. Any other questions? Anybody?
Was the fall of the wall good? In the end of the day, did it
Yes.
help?
And Poland, look what it's doing now in Ukraine.
Right.
It is, I would say it's my favorite country that I ever worked in, Ukraine. Poland, followed by Jordan, which I'm going to talk about. It's an interesting story about Jordan, by the way. Long story. Yes, ma'am.
The World Bank, I don't know if this is fair or not, but my understanding was that it, at one time it had a reputation of trying to develop developing countries in sort of an American style
Yes.
and without tapping on indigenous resources.
Right.
And now, is that true and has that
Oh,
evolved?
I think it's evolved dramatically. I think much of the bank now is run by folks from less developed countries and indigenous cultures. And I would say that it no longer, the American influence and the US influence, can I say perhaps has waned. It still is the largest donor to the bank. But clearly, life has moved on and we are much more sensitive now, we being Americans, I think, at the bank, but perhaps much more sensitive to the indigenous or less developed cultures and sociocultural concepts than we had previously. We used to be the arm of the bank. If it wasn't done in a US style, in a US way, screw it, we weren't going to do it. But it's changed. I believe it's changed dramatically. It's changed, well, when I was working, which is roughly 10 years ago, things were starting to change and we were told to be much more empathetic and sympathetic toward the indigenous culture. Yes, ma'am.
What are your thoughts on Hungary, since it had been a communist country? I don't know if they had a good economy or not, but it seems to be certainly swinging.
It seems to be
pretty,
sort of, I don't know much about it. I'm sorry, I haven't really studied it much, but I don't know, but it's not a country I've ever worked in. And I really haven't followed it that much, but it seems to be moving much further toward the right.
Yeah, right.
Than it had in the past.
People-
Yes, sir.
what made the president of Liberia, Ellen, I forgot the rest of her name.
Ellen Sirleaf Johnson,
What made her go back?
her love for the country. Her father was perhaps one of the most distinguished gentlemen in the country, one of the most renowned. He was a judge. He had been educated in London. He went back to the country. She was living a pretty nice life here. I mean, she was working at the bank. She had 4 children. She had a husband. I don't know, she must have woken up one day and said, I need to go home. But she went back and she lived, they built a home for the president eventually, not much, but right in downtown Monrovia. Her dedication was noteworthy.
When they started sending people to educate them in the US and Europe, was there anything that tied them to
Yes.
coming back home?
Yes, it was basically a contract. It's like joining the military. You go have your service and then you come home. The problem is the leadership at the top no longer thinks that's important. George Way, the current president, is a soccer player. He has amassed enormous wealth as president of the country. He has purchased most of the rubber plantations. He has developed ties with Sierra Leone, which is the neighbor, and they together are basically a rebellious force. And I'm surprised that the country hasn't fallen back into civil war, because he really does not understand the reins of government. He is popular beyond your wildest imagination. He was more popular than Ellen because she was a hardliner. She was tough. She was a force to be reckoned with. You didn't screw around with her. She's as warm and fuzzy as you want to be, but she's as tough as nails when it comes to public policy. I don't think he knows what public policy is. And I'm so surprised the country isn't in a worse shape than it is. Though, as you saw from my discussion, it's considered the poorest in the World Bank's poverty reduction program. It's considered the poorest country in the world this day. Anything else? So we're going to meet again next Tuesday, and I appreciate your being here, and I thank you so very much.